My name is Harper Lane, and I showed up to my father's funeral after it was already over. The chapel doors were unlocked, but the room felt sealed. Rows of chairs sat empty, like someone had erased the day. The air smelled faintly of lilies and stale coffee. On a side table, there was a small metal urn, still warm from a process I wasn't allowed to witness. My stepmother, Celine, later told people I was too emotional to attend. She said it was kind. I heard it like a verdict, in my own family. They thought they were closing a door. They didn't realize they were opening something else. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from. If you've ever stayed quiet to keep the family calm and still got pushed aside, stay with me. I grew up believing my father and I were a team, not in a dramatic way, just in the quiet, ordinary way that keeps you steady. After my mum died of breast cancer when I was 11, the house went silent in a way I didn't have words for yet. Dad didn't try to fill that silence with speeches. He filled it with routine. Sunday mornings meant pancakes, always from scratch, always burned a little at the edges. He said the pan liked them that way. I believed him. We ate at the kitchen counter, the radio on low, the desert light sliding across the floor like it was checking on us. He never missed anything that mattered. School concerts, award nights, graduation. I would scan the room and find him immediately, standing too close to the stage, phone held a little too high, recording like the moment might disappear if he didn't. When people asked me what my dad did for a living, I'd say construction. When they asked me what he was like, I'd say solid, like a house you don't worry about in a storm. There were things we didn't talk about much. My mum's clothes stayed in the closet longer than they should have. Her coffee mug stayed in the cabinet, untouched. Dad said some things deserved time. He believed in letting things settle. That belief shaped everything about him. It also made him vulnerable in ways I didn't understand back then. When I was older, he took me fishing at Lake Tahoe every summer. Early mornings, cold air, steam rising off the water. He taught me how to measure twice and cut once, even though we weren't cutting anything. He said it applied to life too. Don't rush, don't guess, pay attention. At the time, I thought he was just passing down work wisdom. I didn't realize he was teaching me how he survived. He kept records of everything, not obsessively, just neatly. File folders with labels, sticky notes with dates. He said paperwork was a memory you didn't have to trust your head with. I didn't question it. It was just another one of his habits, like checking the locks twice before bed, or keeping a spare key where only we knew. Celine came into our lives when I was in my early 20s. My dad met her at a charity event tied to his company. He introduced her to me at a restaurant we'd gone to for years. He was nervous, which was new. She was polished, calm. Her smile arrived before her eyes did. She was polite, distant. She listened when my dad talked, but her attention drifted whenever he and I slipped into old stories. She redirected conversations without seeming rude. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't watching for it. I tried to like her. I really did. I invited her to brunch, asked her opinion on my dad's birthday plans. She participated when it mattered publicly. Privately, there was always a wall. Not hostile, just firm. When they married 8 months later, the wedding was expensive and perfectly planned. Nothing like the backyard ceremony my parents had shared. I stood beside them, smiling for photos, feeling like I was already stepping out of the frame. After the wedding, her children followed. Bree and Logan, both adults, both confident in a way that assumed resources were endless. They treated my dad like an opportunity. They called him Evan, never Dad, but they asked him to pay for school, cars, trips. When I questioned it, my dad sighed and said he wanted peace. He wanted everyone to feel secure. That was his language for love, keeping things calm, even when calm came at a cost. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of the shift. The slow one. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind you only recognize after something breaks, and you start tracing the cracks backward. As the years passed, my place in my father's life didn't disappear. It just got quieter. I built my own career in Phoenix, finished my master's, paid down my student loans. I stayed close enough to drive over on Sundays, close enough to help when something broke, close enough to notice when small things changed. Celine began scheduling family plans during my visits, dinner reservations, friends stopping by, conversations that ended early, phone calls that went unanswered, then returned hours later by her instead of him. When I brought it up, she smiled like I'd misread the room. She told me my father was tired, that he needed peace, that adults had their own lives. She said it gently, like advice. My dad backed her up without meaning to. He always wanted harmony. He believed friction meant failure. So I adjusted. I came earlier, stayed shorter. I learned how to leave before I overstayed my welcome. At the company, changes happened too. Bree landed a marketing role she wasn't qualified for. Logan started helping with finances, despite a history everyone quietly ignored. Miles, my dad's project manager, mentioned concerns once, then dropped it. Dad didn't want conflict at work or at home. He thought generosity would smooth things out. He didn't see how generosity, in the wrong hands, looks like permission. There were moments that stuck with me. Not big arguments, small scenes. A locked drawer in the study that hadn't been locked before. A folder I recognized moved to a different shelf. My dad closed his laptop when I walked in, then laughed it off. Once, he said, almost casually, "If anything ever happens, check the study, the painting your mum picked." He said it like a joke. I smiled. I didn't ask why. Then came the phone calls, 6 of them, in the middle of a workday. My dad never did that. When I stepped into the hallway and called back, his voice sounded thin, careful. He asked me to come over, said the doctor had just left. When he told me it was stage 4 pancreatic cancer, I felt something inside me go still, like a switch flipped. The future shrank to appointments and drives and waiting rooms. Celine took over fast. She called herself his caregiver. She managed the calendar. Visiting hours were arranged through her. Nurses spoke her name more than his. When I arrived unannounced, I was told to wait. When I insisted, I was reminded of instructions. Mrs. Lane left instructions. It became a phrase that followed me through hallways and doors. Inside the room, my dad looked smaller every time, but his eyes still found me. He'd squeeze my hand, ask about my work, ask if I was eating. Once, when Celine stepped out, he whispered, "There are papers in the safe." He didn't finish the sentence. She came back with a doctor and the moment closed. The messages got stranger after that. A text from his personal phone telling me to check the safe. Then nothing. The phone went dead. When I called the next morning, Celine answered. She said he was resting. No visitors. That pattern repeated until it didn't. Until a nurse I didn't recognize called to tell me he'd been transferred to hospice, arranged by his wife. My name wasn't on the list. I sat in my car in the parking lot for hours that day, watching people come and go, waiting for a chance that never came. When the text arrived saying he'd passed peacefully, it didn't feel peaceful. It felt managed, controlled, like everything else had started to feel. I didn't realize it then, but by the time my father died, the story of my absence had already been written for me. The first sign that grief was being used against me came at the funeral home. I arrived early, holding a letter I had written to my dad the night before. It wasn't long, just things I never said out loud. The parking lot was almost empty, which felt wrong. My father knew half the city. When I stepped inside and gave his name, the receptionist hesitated, then told me the service had already happened. 8 that morning. Cremation already in process. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to make the words rearrange themselves into something that made sense. When Celine walked out with Bree and Logan, already dressed like the day was over, I understood. This wasn't confusion. It was a decision. Celine told me they'd moved the time because I was having a hard time. She said it kindly, like she was protecting me. I didn't argue. I couldn't. My body felt hollow, like the argument would fall straight through me. After that, the story settled fast. Friends told me how sorry they were that I couldn't make it. Someone said Celine mentioned I was overwhelmed. Another said she'd explained I wanted privacy. Each version painted me smaller, more unstable, easier to dismiss. By the time I realized what was happening, It had already been accepted as truth. A few days later, Gavin Cross called. He'd been my dad's attorney for years. His voice was careful. He said the reading had been postponed, then postponed again. Celine claimed there was a newer document, one that needed organising. He told me not to worry, that these things took time. But the word newer sat heavy in my chest. My father hated last-minute changes. He planned everything, especially important things. I went to the house to collect some of my mum's belongings. Just photos. A ring, I remembered. Celine didn't open the door right away. When she did, she stood in the frame like a guard. She told me the house was busy, that nothing could be removed until after the estate was settled. Bree and Logan appeared behind her, arms crossed, watching. Inside I could hear laughter, glass clinking. Someone had opened one of my dad's good bottles. I saw guests leave later carrying small bags, artwork, scotch, pieces of a life being divided while I waited on the sidewalk. That was when something in me shifted. Not anger, clarity. I stopped asking for permission. I drove to the cemetery instead. My mother's plot was there. My dad had bought space beside her years ago. I stood between the two markers, one filled, one waiting, and noticed an envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. No name, just my lawyer's business card inside. On the back, written in my father's hand, were 6 numbers, my birthday, and a single word, safe. I went back to the house after dark. Years ago, my dad had given me a service key and told me to keep it. Always have a way home, he'd said. The lock hadn't been changed. The house smelled different, cleaner, emptier. His study was locked, but I knew where he taped the spare. Some habits never changed. Behind the painting my mother had chosen on their honeymoon, I found the wall safe. The combination worked. Inside were folders, neatly labelled, bank statements, emails, a notarized will dated 3 months earlier, and a letter addressed to me. In it, my father wrote that he feared he'd been too trusting, that he'd noticed money moving without explanation, that he'd hired another attorney quietly, that if I was reading this, it meant he hadn't had time to tell me everything himself. I sat on the floor and read it twice, then a third time, not crying, just breathing carefully. He hadn't forgotten me. He'd been trying to protect me, and someone had been racing him to the end. That was the moment I stopped being confused. I called Dorian Pike the next morning. His number was written at the bottom of my father's letter, underlined once. He didn't sound surprised when I told him who I was. He asked where I was calling from and told me not to discuss anything over the phone. We met later that day at a small diner outside town, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted burned, no matter how fresh it was. Dorian explained what my father had done. A quiet review, a clean rewrite, no drama, a will properly executed, witnessed, notarized. He told me my dad had been calm, clear, concerned but sharp. He'd said one thing more than once, that he was afraid I'd be locked out before I understood what was happening. Dorian slid a copy of the will across the table and let me read it myself. My hands didn't shake. I felt steady in a way I hadn't since my dad got sick. On my drive home, I replayed everything. The restricted visits, the funeral moved, the delays. None of it was random. It was all timing, buying space, creating a story before anyone could challenge it. I realized then that Celine wasn't reacting to my father's illness. She was managing it. A week later, Gavin called again. The will reading was rescheduled. Friday, 3 o'clock, his office downtown. His tone was different this time, tighter. He told me Celine had produced a document she claimed was the final version, signed last month. He hadn't verified it yet. He wanted me there, regardless of what she said. When I arrived at the building on Friday, Celine was already seated in the conference room with Bree and Logan. They looked comfortable, like people waiting for a meeting they expected to win. Celine stood when she saw me and said my name the way people do when they don't expect you to show up. Her lawyer was beside her. Another man I didn't recognize sat near the window, scrolling through his phone. Celine suggested I wait outside. She said the reading was for beneficiaries only. Gavin hesitated. He reminded her that I was my father's daughter. She smiled and said, Not according to the most recent document. Bree didn't look at me. Logan did. He smirked, then looked away. Gavin began reading the will Celine had provided. I listened carefully. My name wasn't there. It had been replaced with language about absence, distance, disappointment. The words felt wrong, not just cruel, inaccurate. My father didn't speak that way. He didn't rewrite history. He documented it. When Gavin asked if there were any questions, I stood. I placed my folder on the table. I said one sentence. "That will is fake." The room went quiet. Celine laughed. She asked if I was accusing her of forging my father's signature. I said yes, calmly, clearly. Dorian stepped in then. He introduced himself and handed Gavin the original, the notarized one. The signatures matched my father's hand. The dates lined up. The witnesses were real. Gavin compared the two documents in silence. The longer he looked, the more his face changed. Celine's lawyer objected. He talked about good faith, about intention, about grief. Dorian responded with evidence. Bank transfers, email logs, a recorded conversation that ended with Celine saying they'd move the money offshore once everything was settled. Logan stood up and sat back down. Bree whispered something sharp to her mother. Gavin closed the folder and said he would file the legitimate will with probate immediately. He advised Celine to speak with her attorney about the consequences of presenting a fraudulent document. Celine finally looked at me then, not angry, afraid. She asked if we could work something out privately. I told her she had 24 hours to vacate the house before I submitted everything to the district attorney. Fraud, forgery, elder abuse. I said it like a list, not a threat. They gathered their things and left without saying goodbye. I stayed seated, listening to the air conditioner hum, thinking about how close I'd come to believing I'd imagined everything. The will reading didn't end when everyone stood up. It stayed with me in the silence that followed, the kind that presses against your ears. After Celine and her children left, Gavin closed the door and sat back down. He didn't say anything right away. He just rubbed his forehead and stared at the table, like he was recalculating a map he'd trusted for years. He asked me if I was all right. I told him I didn't know yet. That answer felt honest. My hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow, like the air had been taken out slowly instead of knocked out all at once. Dorian stood by the window, phone already in his hand, sending messages I didn't need to read to know the direction they were going. Gavin explained the next steps in a measured voice. Probate filing, emergency motions, asset freezes. He said words like this weren't personal, like this was just another case. I appreciated that. It gave me something solid to hold on to. When things get unreal, the procedure feels like oxygen. Before we left the room, Celine came back alone. She closed the door behind her. Her posture had changed, shoulders lower, voice softer. She said Evan wouldn't have wanted this kind of spectacle, that we were still family, that grief made people do things they regretted. She didn't apologize. She negotiated. I looked at her and realized something had shifted for good. Not just legally, internally. I told her my father had already thought about that he'd left instructions because he knew exactly how this would play out. I said I wasn't interested in preserving the peace anymore, only the truth. Her face tightened for half a second before she recovered. Then she nodded like she understood. She didn't. The next 48 hours were quiet in the way storms are quiet before they move on. I didn't go back to the house right away. I waited. I let Gavin file the paperwork. I let Dorian contact the court. When I finally returned, the driveway was empty. The locks were still the same. Inside, the house looked like it had been handled roughly. Drawers left open, bottles empty, a few things that mattered, a few things broke that didn't. I walked room to room slowly, not searching, just noticing. The dent in the wall where a chair had hit, the missing photo frame from the hallway, the absence of my mother's ring from the study drawer. Loss has layers. Some you expect, others surprise you. I changed the locks that afternoon, set new codes, called Miles and asked him to come by the next morning. He didn't ask questions. He just said he'd be there. That steadiness mattered more than I realized at the time. That night, I sat alone in my dad's study. The painting was back on the wall. The safe was empty. I replayed his video one more time on my phone. His voice was clear, calm, certain. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He sounded like a man who'd finally decided where he stood. I realized then that the climax hadn't been the confrontation in the office. It was the moment I stopped doubting myself. The moment I accepted that what I saw, what I felt, had been real all along. They hadn't taken anything from me that my father hadn't already given back. I turned off the lights and closed the door behind me, knowing the fight wasn't over, but also knowing I wasn't walking into it blind anymore. The legal part moved faster than I expected. Gavin filed the will with the probate court the next morning. By the afternoon, motions were already in place to freeze accounts connected to my father's estate. Dorian warned me that Celine would contest everything. He said it calmly, like the weather. I told him I assumed she would. People who lie that far don't stop when they're caught. They double down. 2 days later, the challenge came. Claims of undue influence. Claim that my father lacked capacity. Claims that I had manipulated him when he was sick. None of it surprised me. What surprised me was how little it hurt. Those words had already been used against me quietly, for months. Seeing them typed out just made them easier to answer. That was when forensic accounting began. Not because I demanded it, but because the numbers didn't make sense. Transfers during chemo weeks. Wire requests signed when my father was heavily medicated. Insurance policies I'd never heard of, taken out shortly after the wedding. The more we looked, the more patterns appeared. Small at first, then, obviously. I started receiving calls from people who hadn't spoken up before. A bank manager who remembered questioning a withdrawal. A nurse who said she'd been told my father didn't want visitors, even when he asked for me by name. A pastor who remembered my dad saying he was afraid I'd be locked out. Each conversation filled in another quiet gap. I didn't rush any of it. I learned something watching my father work. You don't swing until you know where the structure is weak. You measure, you document, you wait. Celine thought the will reading was the end. She thought getting caught meant retreat. She didn't understand that I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was building a case, and I wasn't done opening doors yet. The house was quiet in the mornings after everything settled. Not peaceful, just quiet. I would stand in the kitchen with a mug of coffee I forgot to drink, shoulders tight, listening to the refrigerator hum like it was the only thing still doing its job. Winning didn't feel like anything. It felt like the absence of pressure, like I could finally breathe without bracing. The first time I walked back into my father's study alone, I felt like a guest in my own childhood. The room smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish. Light slipped through the blinds in narrow stripes across his desk. The chair creaked when I touched it. I half expected him to tell me not to lean on it like that. I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years and found my mother's ring wrapped in a soft cloth. I sat down and held it longer than I needed to. My father had protected the memory. He just hadn't protected me when it mattered most. That truth landed quietly. No drama. Just wait. Logan called a week later. His apology came out stiff, like something rehearsed. He said he hadn't known about the blank papers. Then he admitted he had. Both statements felt true in different ways. I thanked him for telling me the truth and told him I wasn't ready for anything more than that. Boundaries don't have to be loud to be firm. I started fixing small things, changed the locks, cleaned out one drawer, left my father's desk exactly the way it was. Healing didn't come as clarity or forgiveness. It came as control. Small, domestic decisions that reminded me I was allowed to choose what stayed. One afternoon, I made pancakes, burned them slightly, ate them standing up. I would have traded the house, the money, all of it, for one moment where my father chose me out loud while he was still alive. But I don't get to rewrite his choices. I only get to decide what I accept now. A voicemail waited on my phone that night. From the bank, another account, another question. I listened once, then saved it. I wasn't afraid anymore, and I was paying attention. If you've ever been the invisible one in your own family, stay here. This story was never just about money. It was about what people do when they think you won't fight back. If this feels familiar, subscribe and share it with someone who's lived through family decisions like this. Tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were me. I read every story. Some of them deserve to be told next.